From New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, this is Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. I'm David Weston. We start, of course, with a market check to see what's going on. We have Abigail Doolittle and choppy. One of your favorite words, Abigail, but it certainly applies to today.
It really does. Earlier today on the open, up, then down. Right now, mixed all over the map. And the bottom line is we have the S&P 500 and the Dow a bit higher. Some of those cyclical sectors do a little bit better, while the NASDAQ 100 and the New York FANG index are doing less well, in fact, in the red. And yesterday, David, we, of course, had a very dramatic reversal for that New York FANG index, at one point up 4%, then closing down 3%. That index, of course, has been really on fire out of the March lows, that stay-at-home trade, investors going into it. So a bit of an unwind there. And interesting, on the day, we have the financials pushing slightly higher, but a mixed picture for the big banks right now. JP Morgan really putting up a great quarter despite a large loan reserve loss. That was the case also, of course, for Citigroup and Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo, though, really a very bad day at this point, David, as they put up a disappointing quarter, the first loss since 2008, and they cut their dividend to 10 cents from 51 cents. So investors not liking that. But again, mixed messages in a choppy day and in a choppy time period, quite frankly.
Exactly. And we're also getting mixed messages about the coronavirus, I think it's fair to say. And yesterday, it seemed like maybe the news coming out of California, we're going to shut down, not have schools in Los Angeles, San Diego, may have triggered some of that happening. At the same time, why would that hit the FANG? Because I thought that if we have more coronavirus, we'd like the FANG better because we have to use it more from home.
Well, you know, I think that the two are probably a bit separate. That news out of California yesterday was one of the turning points that did take stocks lower, but the FANG started to turn lower much earlier. And quite frankly, you have these stocks up in a huge way this year because of that stay-at-home element. Also, these companies put up great quarters back in April for the March quarter. So we're into the earnings season now. We'll be curious to see how they've fared over the last 3 months, of course. And there's something interesting here also, David, ahead later this month. We have the CEOs of Amazon, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, Tim Cook, or a top executive from Apple, and then Sundar Pichai from Alphabet testifying before Congress later this year. Some are saying it's going to be the biggest antitrust tech hearing of all time. Not likely action happens, but at least putting that idea of regulation. So when you have these stocks having run so far so fast this year, it doesn't take a lot to push them back in the other direction. Just a little bit of nerves and so much uncertainty right now between the virus, earnings, and quite frankly, what's ahead as you put all of this together, David.
Yeah, fair enough. Although I have to say, I've seen this play before about pulling the big tech companies before Congress. Nothing's happened yet. Maybe it will this time. We'll see. Thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle. Congress has done an awful lot already to try to support the economy, and the tally is really starting to mount up. In the month of June alone, the deficit for the United States of America was $864 billion, and more may well be on its way with a fourth round of stimulus. We bring in now Douglas Holtz-Eakin. He is the president of the American Action Forum and, of course, the former head of the Congressional Budget Office. Doug, it's always great to have you with us. So $864 billion in a month. We're looking at something like 14% of GDP if you don't add some more in. Can we afford this?
We can't afford this. And, you know, it's painful to see numbers this large. There's no question about it. The money is not free. I want to come back and talk about that. But in this moment, the most important thing is to support the American people, get businesses back on their feet, and get the economy to recover. And that's the route to getting the budget in better shape. That's the route to getting everything that we care about, better incomes, less inequality. All of that comes with getting the economy back to full employment. So do what is necessary. Focus on what is necessary. Don't do things you don't need to do. And then recognize that at some point in the future, 2023, 4, 5, there's going to be a moment of reckoning when we have to be able to control the growth of the debt. It can't grow faster than the economy forever. And that will require some very difficult political choices in terms of higher revenues, reduced spending, and that moment's in the future.
Doug, you say the money's not free, but it seems like Jay Powell, the chairman of the Fed, has done pretty much everything in his power to be pretty darn close to free. How much is the Fed really supporting this borrowing level by keeping those interest rates so low?
I think the Fed has done an extraordinary job of insulating the financial markets from the larger fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, if you think back, we had this enormous cash flow hit. There was a mad scramble for liquidity, and the Fed really flooded markets with liquidity, provided that, and by and large, financial markets have functioned very well. In doing so, they cut rates to zero, and there's a lot of cash out there. That's made it easier for the federal government to borrow, but I think markets would have provided this financing anyway. It's essential to the recovery that the federal government have a large role, and I think market participants are going to be far from shy about that.
What more needs to be done? I mean, there is talk right now in Washington. In fact, I think most people sort of think there's going to be another wave. It's just a question of when and how big it is. But have we learned anything about what's the most efficacious way to put money into the economy from what we've done already?
Well, what you hear people talking about are, how much will we have in unemployment insurance benefits, another round of checks, let's get money to states and localities, including the schools. But I think there's too little discussion of the lessons we should be learning right now. For example, with California and other states, this is far from surprising. From the beginning, we knew there would be likely recurrences, regional outbreaks, and some headwinds from the virus itself. And the question becomes, how can we continue to operate the economy in the presence of this virus and not have to shut it down? To me, that says focus on the businesses. What does it take to make those businesses safe for employees to go back and work, safe for customers to go in and engage in commerce? It might be PPE, it might be modifications to the workplace itself. That's going to be a business expense. It's a supply side sort of cost shock. Congress could offset that to some extent with targeted policies to pay for those through tax credits and other things. I think that's someplace they really ought to think hard about. We also know that hundreds of thousands of small businesses have likely already closed their doors. I think that's a hole in the discussion as well. We need to have an effective program past the PPP to get those small businesses starting up again and hiring workers again. Those are the two big key pieces, and they're all on the business side.
Well, and Doug, it strikes me that this crisis particularly is difficult because there's a huge economic question, but you sort of can't answer the economic question without knowing something about the epidemiology on the other. Is there essentially a hole in the bucket? That is the bucket that Congress is pouring money into, because the more we have to shut things down, like in Florida, like in Texas, like in California, we're not going to be able to be refilling that economic bucket.
I think that's a very good point. We know from looking at the Fed data, for example, that households have about $2 trillion more in the bank right now than they had in February. We have poured money into the household sector, but there's no place for it to go. And you don't get a virtuous cycle of recovery out of it until we get the business sector opened up. And so, to me, the mistake is to have either too much confidence on the virus side, say, oh, we're going to have a vaccine or it's just going to go away, or too much belief in sending out checks as stimulus and it's all going to be fine if we just do that. I don't think either of those is true. I think we have to find ways to make sure that we get businesses to operate even though the virus has not completely gone away, and we can continue to put people back to work and to replace their unemployment with a check from their employer, which is what we always want in the end.
In the meantime, we have this unemployment insurance, and the supplement to that
Right.
$600 a week, $600 a month is coming in. Where are you on the question whether that's actually discouraging people? I hear conflicting stories on that, whether it's discouraging people from going back to work.
Our estimates are that the $600 has raised unemployment insurance to the point where about 63% of workers make more on UI than in their previous job, and that's also true in the state and local sector as well. Those government employees, many of whom got laid off very quickly, are better off financially on the UI. So the reality is, I think it hasn't had a big impact so far because we've had large lockdowns and the labor market hasn't been functioning. But looking forward, it's too big an impediment to real recovery. And so Congress will have to separate out two things which are important. One, making sure households have enough support that they can maintain their lifestyles and pay their rent and pay their bills, things like that, and having good labor market incentives. So you can't have $600 which are contingent on you staying out of work. We have to have money to households that's not contingent on being unemployed, that allows you to go back to work, and that's the key going forward.
Okay, Doug, really appreciate you being with us. As always, that's Douglas Holtz-Eakin. He is the president of the American Action Forum. And coming up here on Balance of Power, we're going to talk with Sean Shaw. He's a former representative in the Florida House of Representatives, also the founder of People Over Profits. We're going to talk about what's going on in his home state of Florida when it comes to the coronavirus. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's time now for First Word News, and for that we go to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. The United States is escalating tensions with China on another front. The Trump administration is denouncing Beijing's claims to the South China Sea as unlawful. That aligns the U.S. with a ruling by the United Nations Tribunal. The U.S. sees China stepping up a campaign to dominate the resource-rich region and the smaller nations there. President Trump is downplaying a rift with infectious diseases expert Dr. Anthony Fauci. The president told reporters he gets along with Dr. Fauci very well. Over the weekend, White House officials tried to discredit Dr. Fauci's work on the coronavirus. Fauci says he hasn't seen the president since early last month. Only 8 U.S. states have imposed mandatory protections against the coronavirus, aimed specifically at farm workers to try and halt the spread of the disease. That's despite the CDC releasing targeted guidelines for farmers last month. Farms across the country are turning into various hotspots, with agricultural areas like Yakima, Washington, posting some of the highest infection rates in the nation. Face coverings will be mandatory in all English shops starting July 24th. The UK's Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, will make that announcement today. Those who don't wear masks could be fined. Labor unions, business lobbyists, and opposition politicians have been pressuring Prime Minister Boris Johnson's government about the masks. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Well, Florida reported something over 12,000 new coronavirus cases, which was yesterday, which was fewer than the record number on Sunday, but it also reported a record number, 132 deaths in a 24-hour period from the disease. Welcome now, Sean Shaw. Mr. Shaw is with the Vanguard law firm, and before that, he served as a representative in the Florida House of Representatives and was also the unsuccessful candidate for Attorney General in the state. He, by the way, also has founded progressive lobbying firm People Over Profits. So, Mr. Shaw, thank you so much for being with us. Great to have you with us. Give us a sense of where the coronavirus is today in Florida.
No, I'm happy to be here. Thank you. And the coronavirus is everywhere in Florida, unfortunately. They're really scary numbers. We're peaking every day. And we're just in a place where I don't think a lot of people have confidence, not only in the transparency of the actual numbers coming out, but just in terms of the leadership coming out of Tallahassee, our capital, and our governor's mansion. You know, we are the highest state in the country for coronavirus new cases. We don't have a mandatory mask order. The governor has essentially ordered students back to school. And it just doesn't seem that we're doing the things we need to do to flatten this curve here in Florida, unfortunately.
Well, it's interesting. Let's talk about Governor DeSantis, because he's one of the first ones out of the box saying let's reopen. President Trump really praised him, headed out to the White House about that. Is the governor continuing to have the political support of the people in Florida? Are the people in Florida starting to wonder about whether he should be more strict when it comes to social distancing?
I mean, you're talking to obviously a big-time Democrat in Florida, so I would certainly say that his support is eroding, even if I'm trying to be objective. You know, when this thing first started, our governor, if your listeners and viewers don't know, our governor is extremely tied to Donald Trump. In fact, he only won his race because Donald Trump endorsed him in the primary. So DeSantis owes a lot to Trump, and you can see it in his actions. He's much more interested in the economy and in the appearance of normalcy as opposed to health and risks and what the science is. So he was late to close the beaches in Florida. He was in a kind of a spat with Governor Cuomo from New York. And in fact, we didn't do much to shut down Florida. And then our governor kind of did a victory lap and said, look, our cases aren't even that bad. We're not even spiking that bad in Florida. We don't need to do all the restrictive things that went on in New York. He said that a couple months ago. And now here we are. We're about, a month after he did the victory lap in the press where he demanded an apology and wanted to know who was going to apologize to him for the way he was treated when he refused to go the way of New York. It's unfortunate how much coronavirus and the response has been politicized here in Florida. And I'll tell you, in Florida, we're used to dealing with natural disasters in a non-political way. Democrats are used to giving credit to Republicans for handling disasters and emergencies in a way that, quite frankly, is nonpartisan, in a way that keeps people safe, in a way that makes people feel good. This is not kind of a partisan divide necessarily against DeSantis. This is really just an indictment on his leadership or lack thereof in general. The way he went back and forth on the beaches and the way he's kind of blaming everyone else except himself on why Florida is peaking. Clearly we're peaking because we didn't do all the things we should have done and didn't do all the things other states have done. So this is really a problem, and I do think he's losing political support even on his side based on how he's responding to this.
So, Mr. Shaw, at one point, your governor, DeSantis, was saying that, look, there's a different story across the state. South Florida is very different from up in the Panhandle, and so we're going to handle it differently. Is he allowing, for example, local mayors in Miami Beach, places like that, to be more restrictive in what they're doing?
He is somewhat doing that. At the beginning, he issued a few executive orders and was requiring local governments to do certain things. But, I live here in Tampa, for example. I live in the middle of the I-4 corridor, and our local government has mandated masks because we don't have a statewide order mandating masks. So your local governments are allowed to do some things that might be a little more restrictive. But for the state that has the highest spike in coronavirus numbers, it's unclear to me why we don't have a statewide mandatory mask order. That seems to be the number one first thing that he would do. And now, to your question that he has ordered schools to be reopened, for example, in Broward County and Miami-Dade County and Palm Beach County, they are in fact saying, look, we're not going to send our students back to school full-time in person, despite what the governor says, because we don't think it's safe. And so I think we're going to have some interesting conversations about what might happen in terms of retribution or punishment to those local school districts who don't think it's safe to send their students back to schools. But there's a lot of people who, we've got all these closures. We've got mandatory mask orders that local governments have done. We've got bars and restaurants semi-closed. We've got a lot of things going on, but we're going to send our kids back to school in the face of this. I think a lot of people don't think that's okay and aren't comfortable with that. And it's really going to be interesting to see how this happens when that date finally gets upon us.
And Mr. Shaw, what's the situation with testing? I know that your positivity rate is something over 11%, which is not where you want to be. It indicates there's not enough testing going on. Is Florida ramping up testing?
We are ramping up testing, and to parrot President Trump, DeSantis is, saying that increased testing leads to increased numbers and increased positivity. And listen, we just need to understand we're not in normal times. People are going to be upset if they are restricted. Businesses are going to suffer if their activity is restricted. But to get this under control in the long term, we have to engage in some short-term pain. And our governor here in Florida really wasn't committed enough to that short-term sacrifice. One, because he was getting a lot of heat from the business community, but two, because President Trump was essentially saying that this is not a big deal and trying to exude normalcy, and our governor followed him. And this is essentially the result. Our inability to have the short-term sacrifice has led to these high numbers. And, Florida's got a high elderly population, so we are extremely vulnerable in some other places. And it's just unfortunate. I think this could have been avoided in large part if we'd have engaged in a little bit more short-term pain.
Yeah, so just finally and quickly, where's the business community? Are they shifting their position at this point because they're seeing some of the consequences?
I think that's a very good question. I think, of course, restaurant and bar owners are sick of this. They've had enough. Some of them want to be able to open full-time and do what they need to do, but that's what political leaders have to deal with. That's why you elect governors, and that's why you elect senators and presidents, because they have to make tough decisions that sometimes aren't popular. And the science and our experience and the medical community is all kind of telling us you have to do certain things to stop this and flatten the curve. And politicians, if they do those certain things, are going to take some criticism from certain segments of the business community, and they're going to take certain hits on the political spectrum. But that's what leaders do. That's what leadership is. And you got to make those tough calls. And we're not making them here in Florida.
Okay. Sean Smith, thank you so very much for joining us. Really appreciate that. Sean Smith, he is the founder of People Over Profits. And coming up later, we're going to talk with the Democratic Senator from Michigan, Debbie Stabenow, about Vice President Biden's new plan about green energy. That's coming up on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's time for Stock of the Hour, and of course we're going to pick a bank today. It's a big bank earnings day, and we're going to pick Wells Fargo, which really lagged behind the others, actually turned into a loss for the first time since 2008. Scarlett Fu is here to tell us what went wrong at Wells Fargo. Scarlett?
Hi there, David. Yeah, of the three big banks reporting earnings today, Wells stands out for all the wrong reasons. That $2.4 billion deficit, as you mentioned, the first since the financial crisis. Wells set aside $9.5 billion for potential bad loans. These reserves are comparable to what Citi and JP Morgan reported, but unlike those other two banks, Wells does not have the same kind of Wall Street trading operation to limit its profit decline. It can't count on tens of billions of dollars in trading revenue to offset stress in other parts of its business. So the CEO, Charlie Scharf, was pretty upfront, calling it a very poor quarter on the earnings call. And by the way, this marks the third earnings report under his leadership. He came in and inherited a mess of legacy problems. Think about the fake account scandal and the reputational damage that resulted in, and constraints as well, with the Federal Reserve limiting Wells Fargo's asset growth. So his focus has been to cut costs by slicing its dividend by 80%. Clearly, it's not a narrative that inspires investors. You just look at how the stock has performed in 6 of the last 8 quarters, down, down, down. And of course, it's trailed its peers as well. Wells is one of the worst performing members of the KBW Bank Index this year, down by more than half over that period, David.
Well, Scarlett, you said they're not as big in trading as some other places like Goldman or like JP Morgan or something like that. That means they got to make their money off of lending money and getting interest on it. Interest rates are really low. Can they really make money in this environment?
Yeah, that's a great point, and it goes straight to the heart of Wells Fargo's challenge, because the Federal Reserve has limited its ability to grow its assets. So as a result, it had to pull back from making home loans and auto loans, even with interest rates this low and with demand picking up once things got the worst of the pandemic arrived. So the net interest margin, which is a profitability measure for its loans, has plunged by to 2.25%, more than expected. This is something we'll be discussing with John Shrewsbury, the CFO, later on today. David?
Yeah, that's something I'm really looking forward to. Thank you so much to Scarlett Fu for that report on Wells Fargo. Coming up here, we're going to talk with Dr. Carlos Del Rio of Emory University about the plight of the coronavirus and what we can do next to fight against it. That's coming up on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It is time now for Bloomberg First Word News, and for that we go to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. The federal government has carried out its first execution in 17 years. A man who killed an Arkansas family in 1996 was put to death by lethal injection. It took place at a federal prison in Indiana. In about 2 weeks, millions of Americans could lose a crucial economic lifeline. That's the $600 a week they're getting in extra federal unemployment benefits. Without the additional cash, some of the hardest hit households may be forced to choose which bills to pay. Meantime, policymakers are at a standstill in their talks for more stimulus. They haven't decided whether to extend the extra jobless payments. In Singapore, the economy plunged into recession last quarter due to the pandemic lockdown. GDP fell at an annual rate of more than 41% from the previous 3 months. It's Singapore's biggest quarterly contraction on record, and it was worse than expected. Economists see the second quarter as the likely bottom of the cycle. French President Emmanuel Macron was on hand to mark the nation's annual Bastille Day celebrations. However, the usually grandiose military parade was recalibrated this year to honor medics who died fighting the coronavirus, along with supermarket workers, postal workers, and other heroes. In Paris, thousands protested over the government's handling of the pandemic. President Macron appealed for patience as the country tries to recover. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Well, the coronavirus is back to spreading again in many parts of the country, including in California, which has now banned all indoor activities, and also in Los Angeles and San Diego has said they're not going to have in-classroom teaching come the fall. We welcome now Dr. Carlos Del Rio. He is from Emory University, where he is Distinguished Professor of Medicine. So, Dr. Del Rio, thank you for joining us. Give us your take right now on where we are with the coronavirus. It seems to be on the march in much of the country at this point.
Yes, thank you for having me with you. Unfortunately, we are on a very complicated point right now in most of the country, especially in some states. California, Florida, Texas yesterday reported basically 18% of the world total cases. All the gains we made by sheltering in place in March and April pretty much have been lost, and they were lost primarily because when Memorial Day came and people were tired of being sheltered in place, people were tired of not getting together, people basically said, you know, I've had it, and they went out. They didn't keep, you know, they didn't wear a face mask. They didn't keep safe distance. They gathered in big groups. They went out drinking. They went out with friends. And as a result of that, we are really having a significant upsurge right now, which is stressing a lot of the healthcare systems throughout the region.
So, Doctor, what can you do? Given the situation as we have it now, we've got a problem. It is growing at an uncomfortable rate in a fair amount of the country. Do we have to take a big step back?
Well, some states have already done that. California has rolled back a lot of the openings and has put significant restrictions in place. I think you're going to have to do that in most of the states that are heavily impacted right now. I think you're going to have to mandate face masks. I think you're going to have to close large gatherings, and that includes, you know, restaurants, it includes bars, it includes nightclubs, it includes, you know, churches, it includes places where a lot of people gather. And I think you're going to have to really limit the number of people who can be at any event at one specific time to probably no more than 25. And if you do that over the next 3 or 4 weeks, I think we're going to be start to see a decrease in cases. And then you cannot let the guard down. You need to continue telling people wear a face mask, because we have very good evidence, and I think there's some really nice data from Goldman Sachs and other places suggesting that if everybody uses a face mask, we can actually do a lot of things that we are currently not doing, and we can essentially inject, you know, it will be equivalent to giving 5% back to the GDP. So I think we all need to think about that, and we all need to think that having a safe mask and staying safe is actually going to be the best way to boost the economy.
A lot of people talk about testing, the importance of testing, and then following on from testing, contact tracing. But when you have this level of spread, can you keep ahead of it through testing and contact tracing?
Unfortunately, you can't, and I think you're absolutely right. Right now, you have too much demand for testing, and as a result of that, there's a lot of delay of getting testing, and there's also a lot of delays in being able to get testing results to people. So that's a challenge we're having right now. We simply don't have enough testing capabilities, despite, you know, the U.S. is doing over 600,000 tests per day, and despite that, that simply is not enough. We probably need to be doing double that amount in order to do what we need to do. But there is a problem with having enough reagents, enough machines, and enough people to do the testing.
There's a lot of talk about school and going back to school. As I said, Los Angeles and San Diego say they're not going to do it. On the other hand, President Trump says he wants everybody back in school, the school kids back in the classroom come September. If we're at this level, just where we are right now of the coronavirus in this country, can those states reopen their schools safely?
You know, one of the things that I would say is school opening is critical to the economy, right? If you have kids go back to school, then parents can go back to work. So what we need to do is do everything possible to see if we can open schools, but we got to do it safely. And I think you need to look at your local data. There are many school districts, many areas around the country that will probably be able to open. I mean, you know, when I think about where the epidemic is right now in New York and Connecticut, I think they may be able to open. When you think about states like California, when I think about Florida, the answer is no. There's simply too much virus in the community to safely open. So my point is, if we control the amount of virus in the community, you'll be able to open safely. And we really have to do that. We have to decrease transmission of this virus if we want to open schools and we want to get back to what I would call a semblance of normalcy.
Where are we on treatment? I'm not talking about vaccine at the moment because that seems to be off a ways, but where are we on treatment? We hear about remdesivir, we hear about pronation, things like that. How much progress have we made, really?
We made significant progress. We don't have yet, I think we don't have yet something that is curative. And we don't have yet something that is useful to give by mouth, right, in the outpatient setting. So most of the treatments we have are inpatients, are for people that are critically ill. I think that my dream would be that we have something to give people before they get ill, right? So they don't end up in the hospital when they're diagnosed as positive before they come into the hospital. That we don't have. I think we're in the way to develop those kinds of treatments. But right now, the treatments for those that are critically ill have improved significantly. And as a result of that, and also as a result of a younger population being infected, the mortality has really gone down significantly. So, basically we have gotten better at managing this disease. And the result of that, quite frankly, has been as a result of research. I think research is really paying with improvements in clinical care.
So, Doctor, give us a sense of the healthcare system overall. Where is the most pressure being applied right now? I mean, we had the situation in New York, certainly with our hospitals. Who is really bearing the brunt of all this?
Well, every hospital is bearing the brunt in the areas impacted by this disease. Emergency room visits, hospitalizations, ICU care. It's all being impacted. I'll give you an example. Here in Atlanta, Emory Healthcare hospitals have seen a tripling in the number of patients with COVID over the last 14 days. So we're seeing a stress throughout the system. But the biggest challenge that every hospital has, when you think about surges, you got to think about three things: space. So we can take, areas in the hospital, we can build out ICUs, we can span the areas, we can take and put more critical care areas. We can buy stuff, we can buy ventilators, we can buy PPE, all that stuff. The problem that hospitals are beginning to have is staff. There simply is not enough staff to take care of the patients. And I think that is going to be the biggest stress that healthcare systems are going to have.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much, Doctor. Really good to have you with us. Very informative. That's Dr. Carlos Del Rio. He is Distinguished Professor of Medicine at Emory University. Coming up here, we're going to talk with Democratic Senator from Michigan, Debbie Stabenow, on Vice President Biden's plan for the economy. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. Former Vice President Biden unveils a second part of his economic plan today, which includes a green energy of $2 trillion investment. We welcome now Debbie Stabenow. She is the Democratic Senator from Michigan to take us through the plan. So, Senator, thank you so much for being with us. Always a pleasure to have you with us. $2 trillion over 4 years. This is pretty ambitious. Take us through why this makes sense.
Well, David, this is really important. First of all, it's great to be with you. And secondly, this is exactly the bold vision for the future that we need in our country. And I can tell you, when I look at it, it's got Michigan written all over it. We're actually #1 in the Midwest in new clean energy jobs. And when we look at the fact that what I love about what Joe Biden is proposing is that it's about making it here. It's about using it here. It's about tackling the climate crisis in a way that creates new clean energy jobs and does it in a way that provides opportunity for everyone and addresses parts of our communities that have been hardest hit by the pollution and the inequalities involved. So, and for us in Michigan, I mean, of course, we are the heart and soul of the auto industry. And when I look at the provisions for increased infrastructure, we not only are making the vehicles of the future, but folks have got to feel comfortable that they can go on a road trip and be able to quickly recharge their vehicle and be able to have the same kind of horsepower they need and so on. And I'm very proud of the fact that our companies in Michigan not only are looking at smaller vehicles but larger ones as well. Things like the GMC Hummer with GM or the F-150 truck with Ford that will be all electric, made in Michigan. And what Joe Biden does is embrace the innovation and the future that will create jobs and also tackle the climate crisis, which is very real and all around us. So I appreciate his boldness in every area. But certainly in Michigan, where we make things and grow things, I'm really glad to and excited about what he's rolled out.
Yeah. And of course, I always want to talk about cars. I'm from Michigan. My dad worked in the industry. My
Right.
granddad worked in the industry. So let's talk about that element of it. I mean, one of the big issues is even as we start to make more and more electric models, as you suggested, we have our existing internal combustion engine cars that last a long time. What is he going to do to try to turn over that fleet?
Well, there's a number of things. First of all, our internal combustion engines are getting cleaner all the time, which is terrific that that is happening. And at the same time, our companies are really putting forth a bold vision, not 2050, but 2025, 2022. I mean, looking at where we need to go on all electric, also investing in hydrogen fuel cells and other important areas. And part of what we've got to do is continue some of our tax policies, like the consumer tax credit to buy electric vehicles so people can get in those automobiles. I'm extremely upset that as we were negotiating, and I was deeply involved in negotiating my bill to continue those tax credits, that Donald Trump himself said absolutely not. And as we were back looking at the original package, looking at COVID and how to be able to support what the economy moving forward, Donald Trump said no. Of course, I'm not surprised. I have to tell you that he thought the auto industry should go bankrupt 11 years ago, and Mike Pence actually voted for them to go bankrupt rather than be supported. And one of the reasons I feel so good about Joe Biden is that not only 11 years ago did he have our back in Michigan with our American automobile industry, but after that, do you remember this little thing called Cash for Clunkers that really got folks back into showrooms back in August after they were coming out of bankruptcy? Well, that was my bill. I grew up in a car lot, actually, in a small rural community in Michigan. Yeah. And Joe Biden was the person that helped me get the votes to be able to pass that, which increased in one quarter the GDP by 3% because we were able to incentivize folks getting back into showrooms and give them some confidence. So everything about what Joe is talking about relates to jobs, clean energy, doing it the right way, making sure there's equity involved in what is happening for communities across the country. And it's needed. I mean, right now, I'm ready to go right now.
I can tell. So listen, it's exciting to talk about clean energy in the future and adding jobs and things like that. But transitions are tricky. They're hard. There are a lot of jobs, a lot of workers working in the old industry, the not so clean industry. How do you make that transition without a lot of people being turned out of jobs? You remember Hillary Clinton got in a lot of trouble about talking what would happen to coal workers. How do you make that transition without driving a lot of people out of jobs?
David, really good question. I would say in Michigan, we're already making that transition. That's why we're number one in clean energy jobs in the Midwest. And so whether it's in the auto industry, already making the transition, or energy efficiency, or building the equipment for wind and solar. We have a lot of folks back during the recession in 2009, 2010, that part suppliers that transitioned into wind and solar, geothermal, and so on. By the way, there's 8,000 parts in a big wind turbine, 8,000 parts. We can manufacture every one of those in Michigan. So when we talk about clean energy, you're talking about manufacturing, skilled trades, doing those things that actually create jobs. And in areas like West Virginia, I should tell you that my colleague and friend Joe Manchin and I are partnering on new legislation to make sure that something that I authored back in 2009 as part of the stimulus, part of the tax code called 48C, which was to incentivize retooling plants and so on, that we put a priority on places like West Virginia and coal operations and so on. Well, we need to say to folks who've lost their jobs, a lot of it because of technology and as well as, frankly, other issues. We need to say we care about you, we got your back, and that our tax policy, our support is to make sure that you see the kinds of jobs that are available in the future. That's what Joe Biden is talking about, not leaving anybody behind, and taking where we need to go and making sure that every part of the country has the opportunity to be a part of the success in moving forward.
Right. So, Senator, finally, people are going to say, how can we afford this? I mean, we ran up a deficit of, I think, $864 billion in the month of June alone because of the crisis and trying to support it. We've got a big deficit, a big debt in this country. Can we afford this kind of investment in clean energy?
We can't afford not to, both because we have a climate crisis hitting us right in the face here, but also because these are the right kind of policies that will create jobs and actually grow the economy. The Republicans were very quick to do a $2 trillion tax cut, trickle down, help some folks at the top, we all know, but didn't certainly help an awful lot of folks in Michigan that are trying to grow new jobs. And they didn't blink an eye with $2 trillion that did not grow the economy, grew the stock market, but didn't grow every part of the economy and communities. And so we're talking about a different way to look at how you grow the economy. How do you tackle what is real in terms of the climate crisis? How do you do it with common sense, with jobs, with clean energy policy? And so it absolutely has to be done. And he's proposing a way to do that will actually create jobs and grow the economy.
Okay, Senator, it's really great to have you as always. That's Senator Debbie Stabenow, Democrat of my home state of Michigan. And coming up here, not necessarily the happy warrior. President Trump increasingly is complaining about how he's being treated in a very difficult time, let's be frank. We're going to talk about that next with our Washington correspondent. He's Josh Wingrove. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Well, let's be honest. President Trump is not having that easy a time of it, from a pandemic to a recession to racial strife. And increasingly, he's not making a secret of the fact that he feels a little put upon. We welcome now Josh Wingrove, who reports on President Trump for us for Bloomberg. So, Josh, you have a piece out of Bloomberg today. It's interesting about the extent to which President Trump increasingly sort of complaining, if I can put it that way, about how he's being treated.
Yeah, and this is all presidents get dealt bad hands. It's a case of what they do with it. And the president is really increasingly sort of bent the narrative around himself. He's complained that the FBI has mistreated him. He's complained that the IRS has mistreated him. That's, of course, in relation to him declining to release his tax records. Certainly the media are at the top of his list for being mistreated. Even Fox News, which he watches pretty regularly, he thinks is not sufficiently fair to him. He calls polls suppression polls and refutes the public polls that right now show him trailing Joe Biden, although there's quite some time left in the campaign. So across a range of things, he complains about presidential harassment. He complains that the courts are deferential to presidents, but not him. He really has always put himself at the center of it, but he really is sort of continuing to bend the sort of woe is me narrative around himself right now at a time when, of course, the pandemic is surging again, particularly in the Sun Belt, and Americans are scared and wondering what the governments sort of all levels are going to do about it.
Yeah, it's a long list. You might add China to it, too, because he has a tendency to blame China, certainly for the coronavirus. Do we have any sense whether this is actually a strategy on his part? I mean, politicians historically have not done ill by running against the media. Nobody particularly likes the media that much, so you can run against the media. But running against all those people, is this a political strategy to appeal to the base, or is just this his nature? I think
this is just who he is. I mean, it's always, he's always been sort of the center star of his show, but in 2016, he really tried to channel other people's, frustration through himself. And, we talked about the forgotten men and women of America and that sort of thing. Now it's really increasingly just felt more like it's about himself. So I think that's the change. And, it's troubling even for his staff. I remember it was a couple of weeks ago, his new chief of staff kicked off the week by doing his first ever TV interview as chief of staff. And he said, we're focusing on the American worker. We're going to stick it to China, et cetera, et cetera. Well, within the hour, the president had tweeted the demand that Bubba Wallace, the NASCAR driver, apologize for a noose-like rope being found in his team's garage. So, his sort of ability to sort of change the news agenda can be frustrating, you can imagine, even to his own staff, because they try to set things in one direction and it often doesn't last very long.
Well, Josh, you raise a really interesting point, which is President Trump, I thought, campaigned effectively to say, I'm on your side, whoever the you is, I'm against those, I'm against the swamp. I was actually at a rally he had outside of Detroit just after he was elected with the United Auto Workers saying, I'm on your side as a worker. If he's against everybody, whose side is he on?
Well, I think he's still trying to do that. I mean, he tweeted on June 30th, for instance, in reality, they're not after me, they're after you. I'm just in the way. In other words, he wants his supporters to see attacks on him as attacks on them. But, I really, 2016, a lot of questions, of course, about the polls, right? No one expected Trump to win. The polls are looking a lot worse for him now.
Yeah, exactly. He's got some challenges ahead. And thank you so much to Josh Wingrove. We have a second hour over on Radio, A Balance of Power, and this is Bloomberg.